I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source. Who remembers Bernie Goetz? Who remembers his victims? Or was Bernie Goetz the victim? The subway shooter who, back in 1984, fired at 4 black teenagers in a crowded subway car in Manhattan because he felt they were threatening other riders and himself. 40 years later, our guest Heather Ann Thompson is digging up doubts not so much about the case as about all of us who followed it and fixed it on our timeline of social history, of crime, fear, race, and poverty, the city of New York itself, and its self-esteem. The book is Fear and Fury, the Reagan 80s, the Bernie Goetz Shootings, and the Rebirth of White Rage. Heather, that's a lot of freight for Bernie Goetz to carry. What made him, for you, the stuff of history, not just an almost random news event?
I was working on another book on the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia, a book that I am soon to return to, when I just became so struck by events in the news. Kyle Rittenhouse gunning down people with impunity that he didn't like at a protest. This on the heels of the killing of George Floyd, and that on the heels of the killing of Trayvon Martin, and then fast forwarding to January 6th. And that we needed to explain all of this, that it wasn't enough to just say that America had lost its way when it elected Donald Trump. We had to kind of look further back and say, what happened to make us a nation where we could have citizens just walking around again as they had not really since the 19th century, taking the law into their own hands, and then having the courts legally sanction it.
Yeah.
And having the public applaud it. And then I remembered this Bernie Goetz case from the 80s. I remember it happening at the time. And I remember it enough to know that that might be a place where we might have taken that turn that kind of led us to today.
Yeah, that comes to be your argument, that this was a gateway to the age of Trump. You say Bernie's story in the 80s made Donald Trump in the White House not just possible, but perhaps inevitable.
I think that's right. I think
that's a leap.
Right. First of all, let me just say historians are very good at going into the past and putting things together in such a way that also makes us really understand the present that we now inhabit. But it's actually not so much of a leap. It's one event that begets another event that begets another. But what we really needed to do was to actually go back to the 1980s itself, because that is the real rupture moment. So Bernie Goetz himself and that event itself is very dramatic. It's very media-worthy, newsworthy, but it is also itself symbolic of something else that's going on in the 80s. And it's that thing going on in the 80s that, in fact, leads us to where we are today. And that was essentially the really direct turn we take towards the Reagan Revolution. Prior to the election of Reagan, we had been in what we have all sort of understood as sort of the New Deal America, right? And no matter whether you were a Republican or whether you were a Democrat, there was a certain set of assumptions that we all bought into. And, like that there should be a social safety net in this country, the one that built the American middle class, albeit overwhelmingly white middle class, because it was a discriminatory safety net. But nevertheless, that we needed public schools and public roads, and that businesses needed to be regulated on behalf of the body public, and that there was a certain obligation that wealthy people had to abide by to pay into this social contract. The thing is that for very, very wealthy people, they had always hated that. They had long been trying to chip away at that since the New Deal, and certainly after the Great Society, when it became infused with demands for racial justice as well. And Ronald Reagan, he has his opportunity to finally undo the New Deal order. And the opportunity is the economic crisis globally and the civil rights crisis at home.
We're ready for it in the sense that we never stop asking ourselves these days, how did we Americans come to the anger, the division, the distrust of Trump time, and this air of helplessness that we all feel? There's nothing we can do about it. Learned helplessness in a sense. But we're always asking every day, what went wrong in this country? You haven't found a single explanation exactly, but you do find a single peg to hang the story on. It's that moment, 3 days before Christmas in 1984, just after Ronald Reagan's re-election, when this sad and sort of nebbishy man on the IRT subway took matters into his own hands. Describe that historian's project that you set yourself.
So, bridging what I was just saying about this political moment with this very dramatic story that happens is a really grim time in urban America. It is the 80s, and those of us who can remember it, it felt very dangerous. It felt that things were kind of falling apart. It felt as if people's needs were not being met on the ground. And this is on the heels of a pretty bad fiscal crisis at the end of the 70s. So there is a real sense of dislocation in the early 80s that the Reagan Republicans are going to end up really doubling down on, that a guy like Bernie Goetz, who's just kind of an ordinary white guy living in New York City, comes out of his house every day and he sees the trash piling up. He sees the real dramatic rise in the unhoused population near where he lives. He sees the crisis developing of drug addiction and an illegal drug economy. And he interprets these things as the fault not of austerity politics that are in fact making all these things worse, but as the fault of those thugs, those animals, those dependent, criminalistic, AKA for him, overwhelmingly black and brown teenagers, young people, residents of the city of New York in general. And so he is very resentful of them and feels that the city is falling apart because of them. Meanwhile, over in the South Bronx, there are 4 teenagers who are also experiencing this new austerity politics of the 80s and the economics of Reaganomics. They live in the projects there. Libraries are shuttering their doors. Job opportunities are drying up. Again, there too, the illegal drug economy is becoming one of the only economies out there for people to make money. And these 4 teenagers, Daryl Cabey, James Ramsour, Troy Canty, and Barry Allen, and I think it's important that I say their names because they get erased from the story.
Right.
These 4 teenagers decide that they're going to go into the city and they're going to do what teenagers often did in this period, which was to jimmy open the coin receptacles in the local video arcades. This was a way to get a few quarters. It was a way to get a little cash in your pocket without becoming the person that also had to deal in the really illegal and very dangerous drug trade. So they hop on the 2 train from the South Bronx to downtown. Meanwhile, Bernie Goetz, who lives in Greenwich Village, he also gets on this train. He gets on at 14th Street. And within 5 minutes, these worlds, Bernie Goetz's world and the world of these 4 teenagers, collide in a real eruption, catastrophic eruption of violence that became interesting to me because immediately the story grabs the attention of New Yorkers, of the national media.
Yeah, let me just say, who wouldn't be spellbound as you tell the story?
So on this train are these 4 teenagers, and Bernie Goetz gets on. He sits right across from them. And, these kids are, fooling around, swinging from the straps, being very boisterous. And one of them looks over at Bernie Goetz and he says, "Hey, hi," greets him. And he's encouraged when he gets a greeting back. So he decides he's going to ask Bernie Goetz for $5. And he says, "Do you have $5? Panhandling is rampant in New York City. It is everywhere you go. There's the squeegee guys. There's the repeated asks for change as you're walking down the street. So this is itself not particularly new or even threatening. And he actually thinks that Goetz is going to get up and give him the $5. He stands up, he turns as if he's getting into his wallet, and then he reaches into a hidden holster, swings back around, and assumes a combat stance, shoots the kid who talked to him, Troy Canty, directly in the chest, then shoots Troy's friend Barry Allen right behind him in the back as he's trying to run away, then shoots their friend James Ramsour, who's slightly down the train car, in his arm. That bullet will go through his lungs. And then he shoots the fourth kid, Daryl Caby, but he misses. And it is at that moment, as train passengers are watching this event, that he kind of coldly walks over there while Daryl Caby is quaking in fear, saying, "I didn't do nothing, mister." Mind you, no one has spoken to him besides the first kid. And he shoots him at point blank range, severing his spinal cord. And then he disappears into the bowels of the New York City subway system for 9 days. Nobody knows who he is. And yet the media, particularly the rising conservative media ecosystem that is being birthed in the same moment, dubs him a hero.
I was just going to say, I mean, that's one of the great mysteries. He gets celebrated on the cover of your book in a handheld plaque. Bernie Goetz wins one for the good guys. But come to the critical question. How could a jury of 12 New Yorkers listen to tapes of Bernie Goetz himself explaining to police that he had not meant to harm these boys, but had actually intended to kill them? How could they hear that and conclude that Bernie Goetz was not guilty of anything more than carrying an illegal gun? That's still almost incredible.
That's why this case is so apocryphal, so interesting, because you have this extraordinary eruption of violence on the subway train, and the shooter, who's carrying illegal guns, when he's eventually caught, he goes on the lam, he runs away, there's a dramatic manhunt. But when he eventually turns himself in, he's caught with marijuana at a time when people are doing major time for marijuana in the state of New York and around the country. And he admits, as you say, to everything that happened. He says that he was not being robbed. He didn't like the gleam in one of these kids' eyes. And he was sick of New York, and he was sick of all that had become of the city. And so these kids really trigger a rage in him. He admits to every act that he does on that train. He admits to all of this. And yet, when it finally goes to trial, and I must say it takes 2 grand juries to actually get it to go to trial, a jury will decide effectively that that's not at all what happened, that he didn't really do what he said he did on the confession. He didn't do what eyewitnesses saw him do. And to me, that was a real indication that this was the origin story of this up is down and down is up moment that we're in right now, right? Where our eyes showed one thing and we are told, don't believe that. Believe something completely differently. So this story is one of these moments where this really begins. And I will say that a lot of the characters in this story are ones that will continue to show up: Rudy Giuliani, Donald Trump, and frankly, the most important figure, Rupert Murdoch.
He's almost a central character. What I learned in this, Heather, is that everybody I know, mostly outside New York, missed the story. The reality of poverty, racism, fear like crazy, New York politics, stark division in our greatest city.
On the one hand, it's very puzzling, right? How is it that you could have such urban crisis happening, social services drying up, drug addiction rising, an AIDS crisis developing without anyone really addressing it? How can all this chaos and trauma and fear and crime be going on and ordinary people not be asking, what is going on here, right? Why are libraries being shuttered? Why are people now homeless in record numbers? Why are people turning to an illegal drug economy? And what I don't think I appreciated is that the reason they do not is because they are being directly encouraged to look somewhere else. The rise of this conservative media ecosystem is stressing again and again in, article after article that the problem isn't what's happening with our taxes. The problem is liberal governance. The problem is dependency. The problem is some people just don't want to work. They'd rather siphon off of welfare and sell drugs rather than go to a regular job. All of this is being curated at such a really interesting level. And
Curated, explain.
Curated. So when the really wealthy people of the Reagan era want to roll back the tax code that had been in place since the New Deal. So we're talking about a 70% tax rate on wealthy people, and they'd long fought it. But now there's an opportunity to turn it around, to actually get rid of it, to whittle down those taxes. But the way that you do that is you got to start also cutting social services. And you do not want people to then rebel, right? When things are missing, when things are now not there that they counted on. And so meanwhile, you need a narrative to go along with it. The narrative of the welfare queen, the narrative of crime and dependency, the narrative of liberal do-gooders who would rather throw good money after bad. Well, where are you going to get that cultural message? It turns out that, for example, the Reagan Republicans were well aware that they needed the media to do that. And I found an extraordinary document, for example, that indicated that the Reagan insiders understood that Rupert Murdoch was their guy, that his paper, The Sun in London, would be a great way to help kind of promote that foreign policy coming out of the Reagan administration, and that the New York Post and the Boston Herald would be great places to make that new message palatable domestically. And what is that message? Well, that message is when a guy like Bernie Goetz shoots 4 black teenagers on the subway, immediately he's dubbed a hero. He is said to be the death wish vigilante, hearkening to the Charles Bronson movies of the day. And this is really the key, the people he shot are made into the villains. They are described not as boys, but as men. Yes, exactly. Troy Canty is described as a 23-year-old man. He is not. They were said to have had sharpened screwdrivers that they were wielding, threatening Bernie Goetz. Not the case. It's misinformation. It's making the victim the villain. And that's what I mean when I say curated, because for ordinary people who are picking up, say, the Post or the Daily News, which, by the way, is now competing with the Post for if it bleeds, it leads, sensational coverage, nobody understands what actually happened on that train that day.
It's funny, the Daily News headline that everybody remembers, Ford to City dropped dead, that was old news from 1975. Essentially, that Washington was walking away from New York. I'm also reminded that Archie Bunker from 70s television thought that the liberals were running the country and that, as he said, we were about to hear a loud flushing sound as the USA went down the toilet.
That's because at the end of the 70s, there's really a twin crisis that can be exploited. The one crisis is there is a global fiscal downturn. It's happening all over the globe. It's wreaking havoc in cities across this country. It is one, incidentally, that will turn around in cities around the globe. And it might have turned around in this country, but instead it is exploited, it is doubled down on. And it is a twin crisis because meanwhile in this nation, we are experiencing a civil rights revolution that is making people very nervous about sharing resources that they've long held only for themselves. And it is that kind of moment in the late 70s that, the Archie Bunker feeling, well, the problem here is the liberals, that's the curated message.
Because you ain't going to sell me none of your progressive pinko welfare ideas.
And what have you got against welfare?
Everything. I am sick and tired of people like you giving away my hard-earned money to a bunch of families who ain't even related to me, which they couldn't be related to me for complexionary reasons, if you know what I mean.
The movie masters did not miss the story of Nightmare in New York. Not Charles Bronson, as you mentioned, and his Death Wish series of films in the 70s, about a subway shooter, no less. And Martin Scorsese certainly didn't miss the story in his Taxi Driver movie from 1976. Let's just remember here Robert De Niro going nuts in his taxi.
Yeah.
All the animals come out at night. Someday a real rain will come and wash all this scum off the streets.
The De Niro movie, Taxi Driver, is really the beginning of that economic crisis in cities. This is the 70s. It's this sense of real dislocation. And he is feeling isolated and outraged and really powerless. And so he becomes someone who is angry. That thematic gets picked up on in Hollywood to be a whole genre of these vigilante films. Meanwhile, there's a whole nother genre of television, and that is the celebration of greed is good, wealth is wonderful. So shows like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous and Dallas and Dynasty, these were flip sides of the same coin. People were asked to be fearful, to indulge in their own sense of resentment and rage, but meanwhile, to not pay attention to the fact that income inequality was dramatically increasing in this country, and indeed to celebrate it, to admire it, to hope that one day if you were lucky enough, you too could be that wealthy and live in Trump Tower, for example. You know, we are all cultural creatures. We are susceptible to what we see on television, to what we read in the newspaper. And this is a key moment of political change that is being translated in a very particular way culturally that's going to have huge implications for the way the country then unfolds for the next 50 years.
Chapter after chapter in your book, Heather, you assembled a picture of a demoralized city cutting itself loose from the legacy of Mayor LaGuardia, the heroic mayor, and Franklin Roosevelt, and his whole idea of a responsible, cohesive, caring society. I'm just shocked that I didn't see it. And I didn't see it in the New York Times, for which I was working in those days.
One of the things about the way that all of this seismic change is being translated, particularly by, again, this rising conservative media ecosystem, all media is really being now obsessed with crime, obsessed with this idea that the cities are falling apart, and very, very few of them are asking the contextual questions. Why is that? What has happened with income inequality? What has happened with our tax structure? What has, in fact, happened to a place like the South Bronx that has public housing that used to be a place that white folks lived in, that gave them the leg up, right? That would then send them to the suburbs and to home ownership through an FHA loan. And now they become these places where people are trapped, where elevators don't work, where everything is falling apart. And rather than ask those hard questions, instead, we were being fed very simple answers that asked us really to indulge in our worst stereotypes, our worst fears about what was happening with people that were actually the largest victims of what was happening.
It's interesting. The South Bronx, in precisely this time, would get credited for inventing hip-hop. What did the famous block parties and the superstar rappers tell us about their New York?
A really important part to me is the story of all of the people for whom this cultural narrative never resonated, all of the people who pushed back at it and were pushing back at it all along. And that was overwhelmingly Black and brown New Yorkers who did not support Goetz, did not support what was happening, notwithstanding, I think, a lot of the reporting at the time, and who were also resisting all of this austerity and all of this civic abandonment through all kinds of cultural expression, through the music of DJ Kool Herc and Grandmaster Flash.
Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
Through the lyrics of songs like Fight the Power, through block party cohesiveness and a desire of people to protect each other and one another, to look out for each other's kids when there was few resources publicly to do so, which is why, you know, as grim on the one hand as this story is, at the end of the day, it is one not of let's all give up, because throughout that story is also a story of tremendous recognition of what's going on and resilience to resist that rage and resist that resentment and resist that embrace of unhinged civilian violence.
Where were the Democrats and the liberals in this point, resisting the whole story?
There was a kind of deafening silence when it came to most Democratic Party leaders, just as there was kind of stunning unwillingness to really challenge what was happening economically. At the end of the day, Reagan starts the Reagan Revolution, but for example, Bill Clinton will double down on it. He is the one that ends welfare as we know it. He is the one that is going to pass legislation that puts more people in prison than Reagan had ever imagined with his war on drugs. So when I say we took a turn in the 80s, it is sadly a bipartisan turn that we took. It is a coming of age of a sentiment in America that if we don't actually look at what that sentiment is, that cultural sentiment, that legal precedent that we've now set for you can kill anyone you want, just say that you felt like you were threatened, then, we're going to be in for a rough road no matter who ends up in the White House.
So strange that Donald Trump advertised it almost as a recommendation. I could shoot somebody in broad daylight in Fifth Avenue and get away with it.
That's right. This is a deeply, deeply significant soundbite from Donald Trump because it actually was not a throwaway soundbite. It was really important because, in fact, all evidence pointed to that being the case, not because he was Donald Trump, not because Donald Trump could do anything Donald Trump wants to do, but because we had become a nation where if you wanted to act on your rage, if you wanted to do something that violently in public, you could get away with it.
Amazing the things we say, and who knows where that came from in his case. I got to mention one hero of mine who did not fail the test was Jimmy Breslin, the great Herald Tribune and then Daily News, Newsday reporter, who never stopped seeing race where he should have seen it, we all should have, but saying that it was outrageous that Bernie Goetz had become the hero of this story.
You're right. Jimmy Breslin, such a beloved journalist in this time period with the Daily News. And he is of that generation of sort of liberal reporters who are really interested in questions of justice and injustice and telling things as they actually were. And he's at a paper that is now fighting for its life for media market share with the Rupert Murdoch New York Post. And he's feeling his own paper moving increasingly rightward. And yet he still is willing to go, for example, on the Phil Donahue show and essentially demand that people look at the facts. These kids were not carrying sharpened screwdrivers. And he says in one of his columns, what kind of a nation would we be if we celebrate the paralyzing of a teenage kid on a train because somebody else didn't like the way he looked or liked the way he acted? Like, what does that say about us? He really chides his readers to, think through their prejudices. But he is a dying breed in so many ways of that kind of media figure.
At trial, Bernie Goetz was found not guilty of the serious charge of attempted murder. He was convicted of gun violations, and in a further trial for damages, which went into the millions, he escaped having to pay. How might either the verdicts or the feeling around the story have been changed, come out differently?
That's such an important thing to think about. It's hard to actually imagine it other than the way it happened because, we were in this moment of really stoking and encouraging white rage. When Bernie gets acquitted, I will tell you, though, the implications of that are deeply consequential. The National Rifle Association, for example, not only funds his defense, but sees his victory as critically important to its broader goal, which is to move gun ownership out of the realm of being just sportsmen or hunters and into the realm of personal gun ownership for the purposes of self-defense. So they understand this victory is their ticket to then go forward, to push for stand your ground laws, which they will soon pass across the country, to take court cases all the way up to the Supreme Court that will make it easier to defend yourself with your own firearm in your own home. It was actually a case that law schools to this day teach for myriad reasons, but one of them is the sanctioning, the legal sanctioning of basically standing your ground, self-defense laws that we had not seen prior to that time.
Heather Ann Thompson, I got to ask you a sort of contrary question, but people asked it then, and I think people would still ask it now. Do we thank Bernie Goetz for waking us up to the reality of New York? It was a dangerous place. It was a fearful place. And after all of this was vented, the murder rate in New York came down dramatically when people started paying attention to their own worst anxieties. Thank you, Bernie Goetz?
Unfortunately, no, because it wasn't that linear. It wasn't that simple. So Bernie Goetz absolutely calls attention to the crisis that is unfolding in the city of New York. But the problem was that the reaction to it was to further starve social services, further cut taxes for rich people, and it will lead to the Giuliani moment, which means much more policing of poor people, skyrocketing incarceration rates, making us literally the world's largest incarcerator. And so what does all that mean on the ground in a place like New York City? Here's what it means. It means that, yes, if you have means, New York City is a much more pleasant place to be than it was in 1984. It is shiny. Times Square glitters now. But if you look a little more closely, you see that the poverty has been pushed out even more into the other boroughs. You see that the income inequality in that city has not been that severe since the Gilded Age. You see that countless New Yorkers are still doing massive amounts of time behind bars, thanks to the stop and frisk laws that led them to be arrested for minor drug possession, for a range of poverty crimes. So the question then becomes, New York is glitterier. It feels much better when you get out of the subway or you're riding the subway. But what, in fact, did we solve? And the answer is we solved things very, very nicely for people with means, for people with wealth. Gentrification was a really wonderful thing. Tax breaks were a really wonderful thing if you want to develop New York City. But for everybody else, the reality is that rent control began to atrophy.
Not for Bernie Goetz, who's still living in his same old
That's
apartment.
right. And he's still benefiting from the holdover of those social services that he represented the backlash to, right? Things like rent control. I mean, there's so many deep ironies in this story, and that's one of them. And I will say, after my book was published, something I think extraordinary happens in New York, and that was that Mamdani wins the mayoralty.
Yeah, for saying your city is unaffordable.
That's
for
right.
You.
And for saying you can't afford to live here, we are over-policed, you are underprotected, the school system needs to be revitalized. It needs infusion of capital to make public education better. We need to actually pay for everyone's children to have the same opportunity. He is talking about that social safety net that we have spent the last 50 years gutting and eroding.
Who is going to help Mayor Mamdani reverse this thinking? People in media, too, as well as politics.
Well, that's going to be a heavy lift because the media will have to abandon its now time-honored tradition of stoking resentment and rage and trying to divide people on racial lines. But he will also be really challenging an elite that has worked very, very hard for 50 years to get a tax structure where they barely pay anything, to gut social services, to eviscerate much of the infrastructure that this new mayor knows needs to be there to support ordinary citizens. If we doubt what the wreckage of the last 50 years actually was, we need only look at what the challenges are this new mayor faces. Rich New York got everything it wanted out of the last 50 years. Poor New York lost as much. And now we're trying to reverse that in this city. It's going to be very, very difficult. But what he has on his side is the fact that ordinary people, right, who might not otherwise stand together at the ballot box, elected him overwhelmingly. And, people will say, oh, but that's liberal New York. And you almost have to laugh because that is mythological, right? New York City has not been liberal for a very long time. Giuliani's New York was not liberal. Bloomberg's New York was not liberal. So this is a potentially changing day, but it's going to take a long time to undo the new, effectively Gilded Age that we are now in economically. and to undo what is effectively this new 19th century era of Jim Crow, where lynching is okay again and rage is legally okay.
Didn't Bernie Sanders and the Democratic hierarchs like the Clintons and Barack Obama do themselves and each other out of business entirely by ignoring this evidence?
Oh, absolutely. 2016 is one of these key moments where the Reagan Revolution was really being challenged from below. People were worried that it had not delivered anything for ordinary people, and they were pushing back. And this is why we get Occupy Wall Street on the one hand. It's also why we get Black Lives Matter. And the Democratic Party had a real challenge on its hand in 2016.
Right.
Do we run with that impulse from below where people are basically saying we are hurting economically, racial violence is off the charts, we have to do something, or we're going to run with a candidate like Bernie Sanders? And the thing is, what he was advocating in 2016, it wasn't even little s socialism. That was really what was significant about it. He was advocating New Deal liberalism, which is that you regulate the banks, you regulate business, you fund the social safety net for everybody, and that actually will make capitalism work better and will provide a middle-class life for everybody. That message that Bernie Sanders was touting was the New Deal message. And the answer is a huge disappointment, I think, for everybody but the Republicans, because the Republicans grabbed that same energy that was animating Occupy and said, you know what? We hear you. You are suffering economically. You are hurting. We hear you. But the reason you're hurting is not because of rich people like us. The reason you are hurting is the hordes of immigrants that are coming across the border. And that became the new drum to beat in this longer history of stoking racial resentment on its way to escalating income inequality in America.
Heather Ann Thompson, it's a joy to hear you again making New York real. Fear and Fury, the Reagan 80s, the Bernie Goetz Shootings, and the Rebirth of White Rage. Thank you, Heather Ann Thompson.
Thank you so much.
Heather Ann Thompson is a professor of history at the University of Michigan. She won the Pulitzer and the Bancroft Prizes a decade ago for Blood in the Water, her account of the prison revolt and the official massacre at New York's Attica State Prison in 1971. Here at Open Source, we count on listener support. If you haven't done your part yet, now's the time to go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest-running podcast going strong. Leave a comment while you're at it. We are proud to be a founding member of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent voices in podcasting. Check the range of our interests, from art and technology to history and politics, at hubspokeaudio.org. You'll be glad you did. And thank you